The chamber of the Galactic Council gleamed with bioluminescent walls that pulsed in rhythm with the speakers. Emotions and Commander Thexnar of the Valkyrian Dominion stood before the assembled representatives with his forearms crossed in a gesture of absolute confidence. The humans refuse our reasonable demands, Thexnar announced, and his translator device rendered his clicking speech into the common tongue that all species understood without difficulty. The council members shifted in their various seating configurations, and some released pheromones of disapproval, while others made low humming sounds that indicated their growing irritation with the situation. Counselor Veshka of the Harmonious Collective raised one of her many tentacles in a questioning gesture before speaking in her species' melodious voice that sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Perhaps the humans do not understand the gravity of defying a council directive, she suggested, and her skin changed to a pale blue color that signified hope. Mixed with concern for the situation, Thexnar's mandibles clicked in what his species considered polite disagreement, and he projected a holographic display of Earth's solar system above the council floor where everyone could examine it carefully. The asteroid belt, they claim, contains enough rare minerals to power our jump gates for 3 centuries, he explained while pointing to the glowing region between Mars and Jupiter with one of his lower arms. They have occupied this region for merely 2 generations, and yet they refuse to share resources that rightfully belong to the galactic community at large. High Arbiter Quellen of the Ancient Preservation League spoke next, and his crystalline body refracted the chamber's light into rainbow patterns across the floor beneath his floating platform. What military assets do these humans possess? He asked in a voice that resonated like struck glass and carried authority, earned over 5,000 years of galactic peacekeeping. Thexnar confidence seemed to grow even larger, and he expanded his thorax in a display that his species used to show absolute certainty in their conclusions about any matter. Our intelligence indicates they possess approximately 200 warships of primitive design, he reported, and pulled up technical schematics that showed human vessels bristling with chemical propulsion systems and simple projectile weapons. Their largest vessel mass is only 800,000 tons and uses fusion reactors that we abandoned as inefficient 7 millennia ago. Laughter rippled through the chamber in various forms, including chirps and burbling sounds and the release of ammonia-based humor pheromones that made the air processors work harder than usual. They threaten us with such toys, asked Counselor Reth of the Brilliant Shoals, and his schooling instincts made him unconsciously mirror the posture of the counselor sitting nearest to him. Thexnar's primary eyes gleamed with what could only be described as predatory satisfaction. Even though his species had been herbivorous for millions of years of peaceful evolution, I propose we send my enforcement fleet to Earth's system, he declared, and straightened to his full 3-meter height while his dress uniform caught the chamber's shifting lights beautifully. A show of force will convince them to see reason and accept associate membership terms, including resource sharing protocols. The vote proceeded according to ancient custom, and each species cast their decision through bioluminescent signals or crystalline resonance patterns or pheromone releases depending on their physiology. The measure passed with overwhelming support because the council had never encountered a species that didn't immediately recognize the superiority of unified galactic civilization over primitive tribalism. Thexnar bowed in the Valkyrian manner and departed to prepare his fleet for what he assumed would be a brief and bloodless police action against backwards primitives. 3 weeks later, his armada of 60 capital ships and 200 support vessels emerged from jump space at the edge of Earth's solar system like metal mountains appearing from nowhere. The pungent formation was beautiful and spoke of thousands of years of refined military tradition where wars were fought according to strict honor codes that prevented unnecessary casualties. Thexnar sat in his command throne aboard the flagship Virtuous Determination, and felt satisfaction as his sensors detected the human vessels scrambling to respond to his arrival. "Open a channel," he ordered, and his communications officer obeyed with practiced efficiency, born from decades of similar missions to dozens of reluctant species. His message was clear and followed the traditional format that had brought peace to countless systems. Throughout the galaxy's long history of expansion and integration, humans of Earth, he began, and his voice carried the weight of 3,000 member species standing behind his words with their combined authority. "You have been found in violation of Galactic Council Resolution 7042 regarding the equitable distribution of strategic resources in jointly occupied space." He paused to let the translation systems catch up and imagined the primitive humans scrambling in panic as they saw his overwhelming force arrayed against their pitiful defenses. "Surrender control of the asteroid belt designated as Sol AB1 and accept full Council governance protocols within the next 6 standard hours." The response from Earth came faster than he expected, but the content made his mandibles spread in what his species considered a satisfied smile. The human vessels were moving away from Earth and Mars, and the orbital stations around both planets showed signs of rapid evacuation as civilian transports fled toward the outer planets. "They're running," his tactical officer announced, and released please pheromones that made the bridge smell like fresh vegetation after summer rainthacks. Nar watched the displays and saw exactly what he expected to see from a primitive species confronted with vastly superior force and technology. The human warships weren't forming battle lines or taking defensive positions around their homeworld, as foolish pride might have demanded from a more warlike race. Instead, they scattered toward the outer system. Like frightened prey animals fleeing from a predator, they knew they couldn't fight with any hope of success. "They understand their position," Lexner announced, and felt vindicated in his strategy of overwhelming force rather than the lengthy diplomatic approach some counselors had suggested. What he didn't see were the hundreds of small objects drifting in the orbital paths of every planet and moon and asteroid in the system. He didn't detect the weapon platforms hidden in the rings of Saturn or buried in the surface of Luna or floating dormant in the asteroid belt itself. His sensors were calibrated to find ships and stations and military installations built according to galactic standard practices refined over millions of years. They weren't designed to identify the weapons of a species that had spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of killing each other in increasingly efficient ways. Admiral Sarah Chun stood in the command center of Cheyenne Mountain on Earth's surface and watched the Valkyrian fleet position itself in high orbit above her homeworld. Her weathered face showed no emotion as she studied the tactical displays that showed every enemy vessel and their weapon configurations and their shield frequencies. "Evacuation status?" she asked, without taking her eyes from the screens. 98% complete. Her operations officer reported from his station. All civilian populations are in hardened shelters or in transit to the outer colonies. Chun nodded once and checked the chronometer on her wrist before looking at the faces of her command staff who waited for orders. They'd drilled for years. "The Valkyrians think we're cowards," she said quietly, and her voice carried clearly in the silent room where humanity's fate would be decided. "They think we're running because we're afraid." She walked to the main display and touched the holographic representation of Earth with one hand while her other hand rested on the activation console. "They're about to learn what happens when you threaten a human's home," she continued, and her voice hardened into something cold and sharp. "Authorization code Chen Alpha 77 Tango." She spoke clearly, and the weapons control systems responded to her voice print and genetic signature. "All units are now weapons free, and you are authorized to engage enemy forces with extreme prejudice." She pressed the activation button, and throughout the solar system, humanity's hidden arsenals came to life with purposes built over generations of preparation. The Valkyrian Fleet hung in orbit completely unaware that they had 6 minutes left before everything they knew about warfare became obsolete forever. Commander Dexner was reviewing the surrender documents his staff had prepared when every alarm on his bridge began screaming at once, and the peaceful blue of Earth below suddenly became secondary to the threat warnings flooding his tactical displays. Multiple launch detections. His sensor officer shouted, and his pheromones changed from calm confidence to sharp alarm in less than a second. Source unknown and tracking thousands of inbound objects. Dexner's training took over, and he began issuing orders according to the defensive protocols that had protected Valkyrian fleets for 3,000 years of ritualized warfare, raise shields, and activate point defense systems. He commanded and felt his confidence return because no primitive weapons could penetrate Valkyrian barrier technology. The first impacts came from directions his tactical computers hadn't predicted, and simple metal rods traveling at significant fractions of light speed punched through his shields like they didn't exist. Kinetic energy alone turned 2 of his cruisers into expanding clouds of superheated plasma before his defensive systems even registered the attack. What kind of weapons are these? Dexner demanded and watched in horror as more of his ships began dying in ways that made no sense. There were no energy signatures warning of incoming fire, and no missile drives to track and target and destroy before impact, just chunks of metal, accelerated to velocities that turned them into unstoppable lances of destruction. His point defense lasers tried to intercept the projectiles, but there were too many coming from too many angles, and his computers couldn't prioritize targets fast enough. Return fire on military installations, he ordered desperately, and hoped that destroying Earth's weapon platforms would stop the relentless barrage. His weapons officer hesitated for just a moment before speaking in a voice tight with controlled panic. Commander, we cannot identify any launch sites, he reported, and his 3 eyes were wide with confusion. The projectiles appear to be coming from orbital debris fields and asteroid surfaces, and even the rings of the outer gas giant. Nuclear explosions began blooming across Dexner's fleet. And these weren't the clean fusion warheads that galactic civilizations used for controlled military applications. These were crude fission weapons pumping their energy into laser assemblies that directed coherent radiation beams across millions of kilometers with brutal efficiency. The Valkyrian shields that were designed to deflect particle beams and absorb plasma bolts had no defense against the specific frequencies Earth's weapons used. 3 more capital ships vanished in the coordinated strike, and Dexner realized with growing horror that the humans had studied Valkyrian shield technology and designed weapons specifically to counter it. Deploy countermeasures and activate jamming protocols, he ordered, but his communications officer was already shaking his head in the Valkyrian negative gesture. Their targeting systems aren't using any frequencies we can jam, the officer reported. They appear to be using passive optical tracking and basic radio guidance that our electronic warfare suite wasn't designed to counter. The absurdity of it struck Dexner like a physical blow, and his species had abandoned such primitive guidance systems before they'd even achieved faster than light travel. Now, those same primitive systems were slaughtering his fleet because galactic military doctrine had evolved beyond them and left defenses with blind spots against obsolete technology. All ships emergency jumped to rally point 7. He commanded and accepted the bitter taste of retreat. His navigator's tendrils trembled as he prepared the calculations, but the expression on his face told Dexner what he already feared. Jump drives are being disrupted by localized gravity fluctuations. The navigator reported there are objects throughout the system, generating interference fields that prevent stable wormhole formation. Dexner pulled up the tactical overview and saw the truth, and humanity had seeded their entire solar system with what amounted to jump drive jammers, simple devices that generated just enough gravitational distortion to make Faster than light travel dangerous enough that no sane captain would risk it. His fleet was trapped in the system with an enemy that had turned every moon and asteroid and piece of orbital debris into a weapon platform. Send distress signal to the Council. He ordered and watched another 6 ships die to weapons that cost a fraction of what his vessels were worth. The message drone launched and accelerated toward the edge of the system where it could safely enter jump space and carry word of this disaster to the Galactic Council. Admiral Chun watched the enemy fleet dying on her displays and felt no satisfaction and no joy at the destruction. Spent 30 years preparing for this moment after first contact with the Galactic Council had revealed their military doctrines and their assumptions about civilized warfare. Every species on the Council had evolved past certain types of conflict, and they fought wars according to rules that prevented massive casualties and preserved infrastructure. Humanity had no such evolutionary history, and humans had spent millennia perfecting total war and scorched earth tactics and weapons designed for one purpose, which was killing as efficiently as possible. Enemy fleet is attempting to withdraw to the outer system. Her tactical officer reported, "Should we pursue?" Chun shook her head and touched the console that displayed the locations of every weapon platform and every hidden missile battery and every railgun that her people had built. "Let them run," she ordered, "but make sure they can't regroup and activate the Saturn contingency." In orbit around Saturn, massive magnetic accelerators that had been disguised as civilian mining equipment came online and began launching their payloads. Hundreds of missiles, equipped with basic AI guidance systems and multiple independently targetable warheads, streaked toward the fleeing Valkyrian vessels. The missiles didn't care about honor or civilized warfare, and they didn't broadcast warnings or offer surrender terms. They simply calculated interception courses and executed their programming with mechanical precision. Thexonor's fleet made it to the orbit of Jupiter before the missiles caught them, and when the warheads detonated, they released thousands of smaller submunitions that scattered across cubic kilometers of space. Each submunition was basically a shaped charge designed to punch through ship hulls and detonate inside, where they would kill crew and destroy critical systems. The Valkyrian damage control protocols were designed for external damage from energy weapons and not for internal explosions from weapons that physically penetrated their hulls. 20 more ships died, and the survivors were scattered and damaged and running on backup systems while their crews tried desperately to save themselves. Chun watched it all with cold calculation and years of military training that had taught her to separate emotion from necessity. Broadcast on all frequencies, she ordered, "Tell them they have one chance to surrender and power down all weapons and shields." The message went out in every language the Council used, and the response came back within minutes. Valkyrian commander agrees to terms and requests immediate ceasefire and medical assistance for wounded. Chun nodded once and activated the humanitarian protocols that would send rescue ships to collect survivors and provide medical care. She wasn't a monster despite what the galaxy might think. After today, and she would follow the laws of war that humanity had developed over countless conflicts. Ceasefire order is in effect, she announced. Recovery teams are authorized to render assistance to enemy wounded. She turned to face the secure communication channel that connected her to Earth's civilian government, where the President and the Joint Chiefs waited for her report. Valkyrian fleet has been neutralized, she stated flatly. Casualties on our side are minimal, and we've recovered the majority of our expended ordnance for reuse. The President's face on the screen showed a mixture of relief and concern, because they all knew this was just the beginning. The Council will respond to this. The President said, "We need to prepare for the next phase." Chun nodded and pulled up the strategic analysis her staff had prepared for exactly this scenario. They'll send a larger force, she predicted, probably a coalition of multiple species, to show unity and overwhelming power. She zoomed out the display to show not just Earth's solar system, but the surrounding regions of space were Council territories bordered on human exploration zones. We won't wait for them to come to us. She continued, we're taking the fight to them and showing the Council that humanity doesn't play defense. The president was quiet for a long moment before responding, and the weight of the decision showed clearly on their features. You're talking about offensive operations in Council space, they said carefully. That's an act of war against the entire galactic community. Chen's expression didn't change, and her voice remained steady and professional. They declared war when they threatened Earth. She replied, we're just making sure they understand the cost of that decision. She pulled up deployment orders for the ships that had been hiding in the outer solar system and massive vessels built in secret, using technology that humanity had reverse engineered and improved upon. The wolves are going hunting, she said quietly, and the galaxy is about to learn why. Earth unified under one banner. It wasn't because humans had overcome their warlike nature or evolved past conflict like the Council assumed it. Was because humanity had finally found enemies that required the emergency session of the Galactic Council, convened in chaos, and representatives from 60 species filled the chamber with conflicting pheromones and electromagnetic signatures and sonic frequencies that created a sensory storm. High Arbiter Quellen's crystalline form pulsed with red light as he called for order, and his ancient voice cut through the noise like a blade. The Valkyrian enforcement fleet has been destroyed, he announced, and the chamber fell silent except for the ambient hum of life. Support systems. Counselor Veshka's skin had turned a deep purple color that her species reserved for profound grief, and her voice trembled as she spoke. How many survived? Dex stood before them all, and his once proud posture was now bent with shame and trauma as he delivered his report. 18 ships out of 260, he said quietly. The humans used weapons we couldn't defend against and tactics we couldn't predict. He activated a holographic recording, and the Council watched in horror as simple metal projectiles tore through shields that should have stopped them. They saw nuclear pump lasers cut through holes that were designed to withstand plasma cannons, and they witnessed coordinated strikes from weapons hidden throughout an entire solar system. They turned their home into a fortress. Dexner continued. Every moon and every asteroid and every piece of orbital infrastructure was a potential weapon. Counselor Reth of the Brilliant Shoals released distress pheromones that made several nearby representatives uncomfortable. This is barbaric, he protested. Civilized warfare doesn't involve such indiscriminate deployment of weapons. High Arbiter Quellen raised one crystalline appendage for silence, and his 5,000 years of experience showed in the careful way he chose his next words. The humans didn't violate any galactic warfare conventions, he stated. They simply used tactics that we abandoned so long ago we forgot they were possible. The implications hung in the air, and every species present had evolved beyond certain types of warfare, because their biology or culture or evolutionary history made total war too costly. Humanity apparently had no such limitations, and they'd spent their entire developmental period perfecting the art of killing each other efficiently. We must respond, declared Ambassador Krell of the Titanium. Concordat, and his mechanical voice carried the certainty of a species that had replaced most of their biology with technology. If we allow this insult to stand, then every primitive species will think they can defy Council authority. The vote to form a peacekeeping coalition passed quickly, and 5 species pledged their fleets to the operation. The Valkyrians wanted revenge, and the Brilliant Shoals sought to restore order, and the Titanium Concordat saw an opportunity to test their newest weapons platforms. The Harmonious Collective joined because their philosophy demanded they bring the wayward humans back into civilized society. Preservation League contributed ships because High Arbiter Quellen believed humanity needed to be stopped before they spread their violent culture beyond their home system. 3 months later, A combined fleet of 400 warships and 600 support vessels assembled at the edge of human explored. Space Admiral Kethva of the Brilliant Shoals commanded the operation from her flagship, and she'd studied every piece of data from the Valkyrian defeater. Strategy was sound and overwhelming force combined with proper defensive protocols and ships. Positioned to support each other, the fleet entered human space expecting to find Earth's defenders waiting at their homeworld instead. They found empty stations and abandoned outposts in silence. Where are they? Kethva demanded, and her schooling instincts made her unconsciously seek the comfort of her bridge crew's proximity. Her sensor officer studied the displays with growing confusion before reporting what he found. Long-range scans show human vessels in council space. He said, "They're attacking our supply depots and colony worlds." The tactical display updated and showed a nightmare scenario unfolding across a dozen systems. Human ships were striking deep into council territory and hitting targets that had never seen military action. Mining colonies and civilian transports and supply convoys and agricultural stations were all under attack. The humans weren't following any military doctrine, Kethva recognized, and they weren't trying to hold territory or achieve strategic objectives. They were simply destroying everything they could reach and moving on before reinforcements could respond. "This is insanity," she protested. "They're violating every convention of civilized warfare." Her communications officer looked up from his station with an expression that mixed confusion with fear. "Admiral, we're receiving reports that human forces are targeting our logistics chains," he reported. "They're destroying fuel depots and shipyards and everything that supports our military infrastructure." Kethva's training told her this was wrong, and wars weren't fought by destroying civilian infrastructure and cutting supply lines. Wars were fought through honorable combat between military forces with minimal impact on non-combatants. "Send half our fleet to defend our territory," she ordered. "We'll proceed to Earth with the remainder and force them to defend their homeworld." But the humans didn't defend Earth in the way she expected, and when her fleet arrived in the solar system, they found it even more heavily fortified than before. Every lesson learned from the Valkyrian defeat had been applied and improved upon. The weapon platforms were better hidden, and the fire control systems more sophisticated, and the variety of weapons more diverse. Kethva's fleet lasted 6 hours before she ordered a retreat, and 40% of her ships were destroyed or too damaged to fight effectively. The survivors fled back to council space only to discover that human forces had taken advantage of their absence. Admiral Sarah Chun commanded the offensive from her flagship, Indomitable Will, and she'd handpicked every captain in her fleet based on their understanding of asymmetric warfare. Status report, she demanded, and her operations staff provided updates on 17 simultaneous operations across council territory. Valkyrian shipyards at Tendris Prime are destroyed. One officer reported, "Brilliant Shoals fuel processing facilities at Coral Depths are offline, and Titanium Concordat supply convoy Charlie 7 has been neutralized." Chun studied the strategic display and saw the Council's military machine slowly grinding to a halt. Her ships weren't trying to conquer territory because holding ground required resources humanity didn't have. Instead, they were bleeding the Council dry and making the cost of continuing the war unsustainable. "Any response from Council forces?" she asked. "The peacekeeping coalition is fragmenting," our intelligence officer reported. "The Brilliant Shoals are recalling their ships to defend their home systems, and the Harmonious Collective is requesting negotiations." Chun allowed herself a slight smile, and this was proceeding exactly as she'd predicted. The Council species had evolved to fight wars that were short and limited and focused on specific objectives. They couldn't comprehend or sustain the kind of prolonged attritional warfare that humanity considered normal. "Maintain pressure on all fronts," she ordered. "Target their ability to wage war, but avoid unnecessary civilian casualties." Our rules of engagement were strict, and human forces were authorized to destroy military and industrial targets, but forbidden from attacking purely civilian populations. It wasn't mercy, and it was strategy because Chun understood that the Council needed to see humanity as brutal, but not as monsters. If the Council feared human ruthlessness, they would negotiate, but if they viewed humans as genocidal savages, they might unite in desperation. Admiral, we're receiving distress calls from Preservation League colony worlds, a communications officer reported. They're requesting humanitarian assistance for refugees displaced by our attacks on nearby military installations. Chun considered the request for a moment before making a decision that would shock both her own people and the Council. Dispatch medical ships and relief supplies, she ordered. We're not at war with civilians, and make sure the Council knows we're providing aid. The contradiction was deliberate, and humanity could destroy military targets with brutal efficiency while simultaneously caring for the wounded and displaced. It would confuse the Council and make them question their assumptions about human nature. Captain James Rodriguez commanded the destroyer Swift Retribution, and he just finished wiping out a titanium Concordat weapons facility when his orders came through. We're supposed to deliver food and medical supplies, his executive officer said, with disbelief evident in her voice. Rodriguez shrugged and began plotting a course to the refugee camps his intelligence briefing had identified. Admiral's orders, he replied. We break their ability to fight and then show them we're not trying to exterminate them. His crew worked efficiently, unloaded relief supplies from their cargo base while maintaining combat readiness in case Council forces tried to interfere. When they arrived at the refugee camp, the aliens there cowered in fear until human medics began treating the wounded without discrimination. Rodriguez watched through his ship's external cameras as his people worked, and he saw the confusion on alien faces when humans who'd just destroyed their military showed compassion to civilians. This is going to mess with their heads, his executive officer observed. Rodriguez nodded, and that was exactly the point. High Arbiter Quellen stood alone in his meditation chamber and watched the reports flooding in from across Council space with growing despair. 23 shipyards destroyed, and 47 supply depots burned, and 16 military installations reduced to rubble. The peacekeeping coalition had completely fallen apart, and each species was now focused solely on defending their own territory from human raids. He activated his personal archive and pulled up historical records from the Council's founding 7 million years ago. Every species that joined the Council had followed a similar evolutionary path, and they'd grown beyond aggressive warfare because cooperation proved more beneficial than conflict. The Valkyrians had been herd animals who evolved to settle disputes through ritual displays rather than lethal combat. Brilliant shoals were schooling fish who survived through coordination and unity. The harmonious collective were colony organisms who literally couldn't conceive of individualistic violence. The titanium Concordat had replaced their violent biology with mechanical perfection specifically to overcome their aggressive past. Even the Preservation League had evolved from solitary ambush hunters into peaceful philosophers over millions of years. Every member of the Council shared this fundamental characteristic, and they'd outgrown total war. Humanity apparently never had, and Quellen accessed the files Earth had provided during their application for Council membership. The records showed an unbroken chain of warfare stretching back to humanity's earliest recorded history. Tribal conflicts and religious wars and ideological struggles and resource competitions and territorial disputes. Humans had fought over everything imaginable and refined their weapons and tactics with each generation. When they'd achieved nuclear capability, they'd come close to destroying themselves. But instead of abandoning warfare, they'd simply learned to control it. Unified their planet not because they'd evolved past conflict, but because they'd learned to direct their Aggression outward, Quellen's crystalline form pulsed with colors he rarely displayed, and fear mixed with grudging respect. The Council had assumed humanity was like them and ready to join galactic civilization instead. They'd unleashed a species that still thought like predators and still understood warfare at a fundamental level. The Council had forgotten his private communication console chimed, and he saw it was an emergency meeting request from the Inner Circle. The 5 oldest and most powerful species on the Council only met in person for the gravest matters. Gallen transported to the secure chamber and found the others already waiting. Elder Voss of the Harmonious Collective was the first to speak, and her calming mind voice carried undertones of genuine panic. "We must stop the humans before they destroy everything we've built," she declared. "Our logistics network is collapsing, and our member species are demanding protection we cannot provide." Ambassador Krell's mechanical body showed signs of damage from a recent human attack on his homeworld's orbital industry. "I propose we deploy the absolute weapons," he stated coldly. "Humanity must be eliminated as a threat to galactic stability." Quellen felt his internal structure resonate with alarm at those words. The absolute weapons were devices so terrible that the Council had banned their use 8 million years ago. Planet killers and stellar igniters and weapons that could sterilize entire systems. That would make us worse than what we're fighting, Quellen argued. "We would violate every principle the Council was founded upon." "Principles won't matter if there's no Council left to uphold them," Krell replied before the debate could continue. Quellen's aide interrupted with an urgent message. "The humans are requesting negotiations," the aide announced. "Admiral Sarah Chun is asking for a direct communication with the Inner Circle." The chamber fell silent, and this was unexpected because the humans appeared to be winning, and conquerors didn't typically request talks. It could be a trap, Elder Voss suggested. Klan considered carefully before responding, and his ancient mind worked through the implications. "Or they're offering us a way out," he said slowly. "Let's hear what they have to say." The holographic projection activated, and Admiral Chun appeared before them in her military uniform. Her face showed the weathering of someone who'd spent decades in service, but her eyes were sharp and calculating. "Members of the Inner Circle," she began without preamble, "I'm here to discuss terms for ending this conflict." Ambassador Krell's mechanical voice carried clear hostility as he responded. "You attack us without provocation, and then demand negotiations from a position you think is strength." Chun's expression didn't change, and she pulled up a tactical display that showed the current disposition of forces. "Let me be clear about the strategic situation," she stated. "My forces have destroyed 30% of your military production capacity and crippled your logistics network across 40 systems." She zoomed in on specific targets and highlighted installations the Council didn't even know had been compromised. "We've done this without deploying our full arsenal," she continued. "We have weapons we haven't used because we don't want to exterminate you." The projection changed and showed technical specifications for devices. The Council had never seen antimatter warheads that could crack planets and relativistic missiles that traveled at 90% light speed and AI-controlled swarms of hunter-killer drones. "These weapons exist, and they're deployed," Chun stated flatly. "We could turn this from a limited conflict into something that ends civilizations." Elder Voss's colony mind voice trembled as she spoke. "You're threatening genocide." Chun shook her head slowly and deliberately. "I'm explaining reality," she corrected. "The Council made a mistake when you assumed humanity would surrender because you had superior numbers." She leaned forward, and her intensity was evident even through the holographic transmission. "We didn't want this war," she continued. "Earth was content to exist on the edge of Council space and develop our systems in peace. You demanded our resources and threatened our sovereignty, and gave us no choice but to fight." Quellen's ancient mind recognized truth when he heard it, and he'd reviewed the initial contact reports. The Gibi Council had approached humanity with arrogance and assumed compliance. "What are your terms?" he asked quietly. Chun pulled up a document that had clearly been prepared well in advance. "First, full recognition of Earth's sovereignty over our home system and all territories we've settled. Second, reparations for the destruction your forces caused during the initial attack on Earth. Third, demilitarized zones along our borders, monitored and enforced by human peacekeeping forces. Fourth, full Council membership with voting rights and veto power on matters affecting human interests." The demands were outrageous and went far beyond what any species had ever demanded from the Council. Ambassador Krull's response was immediate and angry. "These terms are unacceptable," he declared. "You ask us to reward your aggression with power and authority." Chun's smile was cold and held no warmth or humor. "I'm not asking," she replied. "I'm telling you what the price of peace is, because the alternative is we continue this war." She pulled up projections that showed what would happen if the conflict continued. Council military capacity would be reduced to nothing within 2 years, and human forces would control all major strategic resources. "You can't sustain this kind of warfare," she explained. "Your species evolved past it, and your industrial base isn't designed for total war. Humanity never stopped preparing for exactly this scenario, and we can keep fighting for decades if necessary." Elder Voss released pheromones of defeat, and her colony mind was fracturing under the stress of the situation. "What guarantee do we have that you will honor these terms?" she asked. Chun's expression softened slightly, and for the first time showed something other than cold calculation. "You have my word as a representative of Earth," she stated. "Humanity doesn't want to rule the galaxy or destroy the Council. We just want to be left alone to pursue our own destiny without interference." She paused before adding one more critical point. "And we want the Council to understand that Earth will defend itself with whatever force is necessary." Quellen made a decision that he knew would define his legacy and possibly the future of the entire Galactic Council. "I propose we accept these terms," he stated clearly. "The alternative is mutual destruction and the collapse of everything we've built over millions of years." The debate that followed lasted 6 hours and involved every member of the inner circle presenting arguments for and against Ambassador. Krell insisted they could still win if they committed fully to the war. Efford Eldervus argued that humanity's demands would destabilize the entire Council structure. Others pointed out that accepting these terms meant admitting the Council had been wrong. But Quellen kept bringing them back to one simple fact, and they were losing this war not because humanity was more numerous or more technologically advanced, but because humans understood violence in ways the Council had forgotten. Finally, the vote came, and it passed by the narrowest possible margin. The Council would accept Earth's terms and end the war. Chun received the notification aboard her flagship and allowed herself a moment of relief before turning to her staff. "Recall all offensive operations," she ordered. "Begin redeployment to defensive positions and prepare humanitarian aid for affected Council territories." The Treaty of Luna was signed in Earth's orbit aboard a neutral diplomatic vessel designed specifically for the occasion. Representatives from 40 Council species attended and watched as High Arbiter Quellen and President Maria Santos placed their marks on the holographic document. Admiral Sarah Chun stood in dress uniform behind the President, and her presence served as a reminder of the military force that had brought the Council to this moment. The terms were exactly as Chun had demanded, and Earth received full sovereignty and reparations in demilitarized zones and Council membership with unprecedented authority. But the treaty included one additional clause that the President had insisted upon. Earth would provide military protection for Council space against external threats. "We didn't fight this war to become conquerors," President Santos stated during her address to the assembled diplomats. "We fought to earn the right to stand as equals among you." She gestured toward the viewport, where Earth hung like a blue jewel against the darkness. humanity will use our capabilities to defend the peace we've all agreed to, and not to dominate those weaker than us. The words were carefully chosen and designed to reassure species that still feared human aggression. But everyone in that chamber understood the underlying reality. Earth was now the most powerful military force in known space, and what they chose to do with that power would shape galactic civilization 6 months after the treaty signing. Admiral Chun walked through the corridors of the newly constructed Earth Defense Force headquarters on Luna. The facility was massive and housed the command structure for human forces now deployed across Council space. She entered the Strategic Operations Center and found her staff monitoring dozens of situations simultaneously. Status report. She requested and settled into her command chair. Human patrol vessels have intercepted a Void Raider attack fleet at the edge of Valkyrian space. Her tactical officer reported the Void Raiders were a nomadic species from beyond Council borders, who'd been raiding outlying systems for centuries. The Council's ritualized warfare had been ineffective against enemies who didn't follow the same rules. The Raiders attempted to engage using their standard hit-and-run tactics. The officer continued, "Our forces destroyed their entire fleet in 40 minutes. Chun nodded, and this was the third such engagement this month. Human warships patrolling Council borders were proving devastatingly effective against external threats. Casualties: none on our side, and we captured 200 raiders for processing according to Council law." The communications console activated and showed Counselor Veshka requesting a private channel. Chun accepted, and the harmonious collective representative appeared, with her skin showing colors of gratitude. "Admiral Chun, the collective wishes to express appreciation for your force's protection of our colony worlds," Veshka said. "The Void Raiders have plagued us for generations, and you've driven them away in months." Chun inclined her head in acknowledgement of the thanks. "Earth takes its treaty obligations seriously," she replied. "Your people are under our protection now." After the transmission ended, her executive officer approached with a thoughtful expression. "It's strange," he observed. 6 months ago, we were destroying their shipyards, and now we're defending their colonies." Chun understood his confusion because the transition from enemy to protector had been rapid. "War is simple," she explained. "You identify the Dia's enemy and you destroy their ability to fight. Peace is harder because you have to build something that lasts." She pulled up a display showing human ships deployed across Council space in defensive formations. "We proved we could break things," she continued. "Now we have to prove we can protect them." The proof came in many forms. Over the following year, human engineering teams helped rebuild the facilities destroyed during the war and used techniques and materials that made them more efficient than before. Human medical ships responded to disasters across Council space and brought capabilities no other species possessed. Human negotiators mediated disputes between Council members, and their outside perspective often found solutions that satisfied everyone. But the most significant change was psychological. The galaxy had spent millions of years assuming that advanced civilizations naturally evolved beyond aggressive warfare. Humanity's existence challenged that assumption and forced the Council to reconsider fundamental beliefs about the nature of intelligence and civilization. Dr. Marcus Webb taught xenosociology at the New Earth University on Mars, and his lectures on human Council relations drew students from dozens of species. The Council made a category error. He explained to a class that included 7 different species. They assumed that because they'd evolved past total war, all intelligent species would follow the same path. A Vulcarian student raised one of his 4 arms in question. "But surely cooperation is more beneficial than conflict." The student argued, "Evolution should favor peaceful species." Webb nodded at the observation. "That's true if your environment allows for it," he agreed. "But Earth's evolutionary history was different from yours." He pulled up comparative data showing Earth's ecosystem compared to other Council homeworlds. Your species evolved as herd animals on a world with abundant resources and few large predators. You developed cooperation because it helped you survive, and aggression was costly. The holographic display shifted to show Earth's more hostile environment. Humanity evolved as persistence hunters on a world with megafauna predators and limited resources. We developed cooperation too, but we also developed the ability to coordinate lethal violence. A student from the Brilliant Shoals spoke up with their translated voice, carrying confusion. But how can you be both cooperative and violent? Webb smiled at the question because it highlighted the fundamental misunderstanding. We're cooperative within our groups and competitive between them, he explained. That's what made us successful, and it's what the Council failed to understand. The class discussion continued, but Webb's mind was elsewhere. Been asked to contribute to a report on long-term human council integration and the fold integration, and the fold EMS to contribute to a report on long-term human council integration, and the FA. Findings were troubling. Other species were studying human warfare tactics and trying to adapt them for their own use. The problem was that most council species lacked the biological or cultural foundation to effectively employ human-style military. Dr. New couldn't just copy the tactics without understanding the mindset that created them. Meanwhile, on Earth itself, society was grappling with its new role in Galactic Affairs. Commander Jessica Torres stood before a classroom of new recruits. At the Earth Defense Force Academy in Colorado, you're joining the military at a unique moment in human history. She told them, for the first time, we're not fighting other humans, and we're defending aliens who months ago were our enemies. She paced in front of the assembled recruits and studied their young faces. Some of you will serve on ships patrolling Council borders. She continued, others will work with alien forces in joint operations, and all of you will be ambassadors for humanity. A recruit raised her hand with a question. Commander, how do we know the Council won't turn on us again? Torres had expected this, and it was a concern many humans shared. We don't. She answered honestly. Trust has to be earned on both sides, and that takes time. What we do know is that right now we're needed, and as long as we fulfill our role professionally, the Council has every reason to maintain the peace. She pulled up a tactical display showing the current deployment of human forces. We're the strongest military power in known space. She stated, but strength without wisdom is just brutality, and our job is to be both strong and wise. The training continued, but Torres thought about what she'd told the recruits. Humanity had proven they could wage war more effectively than species. With millions of years of advancement, now they had to prove they could be trusted with that capability. High Arbiter Quellen addressed the full Galactic Council for what he knew would be his final session before retirement. His crystalline form had dimmed slightly with age, but his voice still carried authority. 3 years ago, we made a decision that many of you opposed. He began. We granted humanity full Council membership and military authority after they defeated our forces. The chamber was silent as thousands of representatives listened. I want to speak to you about what we've learned since then. He activated displays showing comparative data on Council security before and after human involvement. Void Raider attacks have decreased by 94%. He reported, border incursions from hostile species have effectively ceased, and internal conflicts between member species have reached historic lows. The numbers spoke for themselves, and human military effectiveness had brought stability the Council hadn't seen in millennia. But more importantly, Quellen continued, and his tone shifted to something more philosophical. Humanity has taught us that we'd forgotten something essential about the nature of peace. He paused to let the translation systems catch up. Peace isn't the absence of capability for violence. He explained. It's the choice to not employ that capability. We evolved past aggressive warfare, and we thought that made us superior. But humans chose to control their violent nature, and that choice has more moral weight than our biological programming. The implications rippled through the chamber as species considered what he was saying. The council must adapt, Quellen declared.